Hey guys, tonight we comb our way into one of the most spectacularly unnecessary but delightfully specific corners of European history. You are about to wander the velvety, wax-slicked world of 18th century Polish nobility, where men in embroidered coats spent more time fussing over their mustaches than actually stabbing each other in duels. Yes, truly a realm where a single strand of hair falling out of place might spark bloodshed. Or at least a very stern letter in cursive. You'll trudge through morning routines involving pine-scented oils and handcrafted silver combs. Watch gentlemen draw swords only after perfecting their whisker symmetry, and learn how a well-groomed mustache could mean the difference between honor and total social annihilation. You probably won't survive this not because it's dangerous, but because the sheer volume of pre-duel grooming rituals might knock you unconscious with boredom before the swordplay even starts. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself strolling through the morning fog of a Polish manor estate, somewhere around 1764. Roosters crow, hooves clop. A servant quietly curses under his breath while hauling a velvet-lined grooming chest into the solar. Inside the manor, a Mustaches, a nobleman of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, is already seated, shirtless, expectant. His valet gently fluffs his mustache like it's an endangered bird. Here comes your mainstream historical fact. The Polish szlachta made up roughly 8 to 10% of the population, a startlingly high proportion of nobility for any European country at the time. Their privileges were immense, exempt from taxes, military service often voluntary, and, most notably, they could duel basically whenever they wanted, often over matters as grave as chair placement at dinner. But power alone wasn't enough. Appearances mattered, especially the face, especially that stripe of dignity curling above the lip. The valet begins the ritual. First, soap and water, then a warming balm of pine resin, bear fat, and herbs with names that sound made up: marjoram, Ella, campaign, and goosefoot. You wince. The scent is both regal and slightly feral. And here's your quirky tidbit. Bear fat was considered ideal for facial hair because it was believed to carry the animal's strength and courage. One noble even swore that applying it made him immune to fear and slightly better at poetry. Historians remain skeptical on both fronts. The valet now introduces the comb small, carved from ivory. Possibly stolen from a bishop, he hums a lullaby as he works. Part priest, part hairdresser. You watch the nobleman stare into a gilt mirror, evaluating his reflection not as a man, but as a statement. He gives a small nod. The ends curl upward in perfect symmetry, like quotation marks announcing his readiness. It's all quite serious, almost holy, and historians still argue, as they love to do, whether this level of grooming was purely vanity or if it served as a psychological preparation, a kind of meditative ritual that steadied a man before risking his life in a duel. You can believe it. The process is so meticulous, it slows the heartbeat, quiets the nerves, and when a man finishes wax-gleaming mustache, curling skyward like the wings of a majestic, slightly smug bird, he feels ready, not to kill, but to be seen. You wander out through the manor gate. The noble strides behind you, mustache catching the morning light like a heraldic banner. He isn't going to battle just yet, but he wants people to think he might. A neighbor bows from atop a prancing stallion. He too has combed, clearly, and his mustache curls just slightly higher. You feel it coming. They lock eyes, and as the mustaches bristle in silent challenge, you realize this day has only just begun. The morning is crisp, and the mustaches are sharper than the swords they accompany. You follow the nobleman as he strides toward the stables, each bootfall an echo of pride, perfume, and a touch of pomposity. His valet trails just behind, discreetly carrying an emergency grooming kit, because heaven forbid a curl droop mid-confrontation. Out here in the fresh air, with the sound of hooves and the smell of wood smoke, the grooming ritual continues in more subtle forms. A noble must maintain the edge. You arrive at the training paddock, It's less of a battlefield, more of a gentleman's spa. If that spa included sabers and arguments over whose ancestor once insulted whose great-uncle's goose. And here comes today's mainstream historical fact. The 18th century Polish szlachta were deeply attached to personal ritual and identity. Their grooming habits weren't just indulgent, they were expected. Clean-shaven faces were practically taboo. A thick mustache wasn't a suggestion, it was a requirement for adulthood, honor, and most importantly, being taken seriously at breakfast. Our nobleman, let's call him Janusz, removes a tiny tin from his sash. Inside, his personal blend of mustache wax containing beeswax, lard, rosemary oil, and brace yourself a splash of vodka. It stiffens the curls and your sense of shame. Janusz applies it with a tiny boar hair brush. You admire the precision, each hair coaxed into place like it owes him rent. This isn't about style. This is defense. You glance around. Another noble enters the paddock. His mustache twitches in what you can only interpret as open disdain. Janusz sees it too, and he combs again. Here's your quirky tidbit. Noblemen sometimes kept separate combs for left and right sides of the mustache. Why? Superstition. One side was believed to carry luck, the other temperance. Combing with the wrong side. Risk of public embarrassment. Or worse, bad poetry. Tension builds. Janusz mounts his horse. He isn't planning to duel, not yet, but posture is everything. He makes sure his mustache sits just above the collar line, where it will be most visible in silhouette. This is no accident. He trained for this. He rides past a group of peasants hauling sacks of grain. They pause, bow slightly, and nod. Not at the horse, not at the saber, at the mustache. You begin to understand this isn't vanity. This is communication, a way of speaking without words. And historians still argue whether this elaborate grooming culture was a reaction to the growing threat of foreign influence Russia, Prussia, and Austria, or simply the extension of centuries-old customs passed down through generations of mustachioed forefathers who took their hair as seriously as their land. Janusz dismounts. He's informed that another noble Count Piotr has written a letter of concern. Something about fencing protocol and the proper curvature of horse spurs. Janusz narrows his eyes. I'll respond in person, he says, but not before one last combing. Back at the manor, a second valet prepares the dual drawer. You peer over his shoulder. Inside, 2 spare combs, a vial of beard oil, a fine-toothed mustache rake likely French, and a medallion depicting Saint Vossoif, the unofficial patron of perfectly symmetrical facial hair. You marvel at the devotion, the care, the absurdity, but also the commitment. Because in this world, to show up with an untamed mustache is to invite disaster, or at the very least, snide comments in Latin. Later that afternoon, Janusz sets off to meet Count Piotr, not with weapons drawn yet, but with his lip art fully armed. There's a moment on the road when the wind nearly disrupts a single waxed curl. He halts, recombs, then proceeds. That's what separates a gentleman from a barbarian, not the sword, but the comb. By the time you reach Count Piotr's estate, the sky is a smudge of silver gray, and the air tastes faintly of rain and repressed insults. The horses huff, the valets trade polite glares, and your noble companion, Janusz, stands in the middle of the gravel courtyard, carefully adjusting his mustache in a reflection pool meant for swans. Count Piotr emerges like he's been waiting for hours, draped in a brocade robe so heavy it may have its own tax bracket. But the robe is secondary. Your eyes and his are drawn to the face. His mustache is fierce, aggressively symmetrical, twisted upward at the ends like 2 sabers. Frozen mid-parry. Janusz's jaw tightens. They bow. They click heels. They say nothing. But they are, in fact, speaking volumes with their facial hair. And here's your mainstream historical fact. Dueling among the Polish szlachta was governed by intricate codes of behavior, many of which were unwritten. The Codex Honorowi honor code wouldn't be published until the 19th century, but even in the 1700s, a shared language of etiquette and body language, including grooming standards, helped nobles navigate their endless honor disputes without devolving into utter chaos. Well, not total chaos. Janusz removes his gloves. Slowly, Piotr raises one eyebrow and a single waxed whisker trembles in return. You blink. Are they mustache fencing? You lean in. Janus combs. One upward stroke, then a pause. Pyotr mirrors the motion, but clockwise. Tension bristles between their faces. A valet coughs. Somewhere, a chicken panics. This silent grooming showdown could go on for hours if someone doesn't break the pattern. Finally, Pyotr speaks. I hear, he says. You've been teaching peasants to fence with broomsticks? Janus tilts his head. Better that than your students fencing with soup ladles. A gasp? It's begun. Not the duel. Not yet. First comes the sass. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some nobles reportedly prepared snide remarks and practiced them in the mirror, ensuring their facial hair would enhance the effect. One even commissioned a wax blend specifically to stiffen his mustache during sarcastic eyebrow lifts. The result, a judgment curl that allegedly sent 3 lesser nobles into early retirement. Back in the courtyard, Pyotr adjusts his sash. I assume you brought your blade, he says. Janus replies, of course, and 3 spare combs. Another gasp? Even the goose waddling by looks scandalized. The servants set about preparing the dueling lawn-flattening grass, checking sword edges, and brushing away any errant twigs that might snag a boot or, more tragically, a mustache tip. Janusz steps aside and dips a cloth in rosewater, then gently smooths it over his cheeks. The ritual continues. Historians still argue whether this obsessive pre-duel grooming was sincere preparation or a calculated display of emotional control. After all, a man who calmly adjusts his whiskers while waiting to be stabbed clearly isn't rattled, or sane, or both. You wander to the dueling circle's edge and notice a small wooden stand. On it, 2 glass cases. Each one houses a custom mustache comb. The referee will inspect both before the duel begins. Why? Because, and this is real, tampering with another man's grooming tools was considered a grievous offense, equal in some places to poisoning a wine goblet or kicking someone's dog. The nobles remove their coats. They salute with blades. The crowd murmurs. The tension rises. And then they stop. Pyotr frowns. Is your right curl drooping? He asks. More concerned than smug, Janusz fumbles. He reaches for his wax tin, but it's empty. A hush. Pyotr sighs, steps forward, and produces his own wax. I won't duel a man with an unarmed face, he says quietly. Janusz accepts. Re-waxes. Recom. Now, they're ready. The swords gleam. But honestly, the mustaches, they shine. The blades rise. Not in rage, not in haste, but like a curtain being pulled back before a particularly self-important play. The spectators lean in, breath held, not just for the clashing of steel, but for the subtler duel, the quiet tension dancing between 2 impeccably groomed faces. You watch as Janusz circles to the left. Pyotr mirrors. Clockwise, their feet crunch softly over gravel. Swords twitch in their hands, but their mustaches remain gloriously still, like hawks poised to strike but choosing restraint. Here's your mainstream historical fact. For all their talk of honor and readiness, most Polish noble duels didn't end in death. In fact, many ended with a superficial wound or even a draw. The purpose was rarely to kill. It was to prove to show courage, dignity, and the emotional stillness required to hold a blade at a friend's chest without flinching or sweating off your mustache wax. A quick faint clang. Pyotr parries. Janusz grunts and counters. But what distracts you isn't the saber, it's his right-hand curl, still holding firm. You're proud of it. That thing has survived wind, tension, and 3 passive-aggressive remarks about soup ladles. And here's your quirky tidbit. Mustaches were sometimes so heavily waxed that during a particularly intense duel, one nobleman's mustache reportedly snapped clean off mid-swipe. It landed in his opponent's coat pocket. Neither man noticed until tea time. The severed curl was later kept in a velvet pouch as a token of respect. Back in the courtyard, the duel continues but slows, each movement precise, clean, restrained. Pyotr finally lands a touch just a graze to the arm. Janusz nods once, steps back, and offers a salute. It's over. No need for bloodletting. No unseemly drama. They both remain upright. And more importantly, stylish. They lower their swords. Piotr's valet rushes in with a cold compress and, yes, a whisker straightener. Janusz waves his own assistant off and instead reaches for his favorite comb, the one with the little brass owl engraved on the handle. The two men sit on a bench, silently smoothing their curls. There's no need to speak. The language of wax and wire has already said everything worth saying. Historians still argue whether the obsession with facial hair among the Szlachta was inspired by cultural pride, regional rivalry, or a collective midlife crisis that lasted for generations. Either way, it left its mark on art, on literature, and on the combs now resting in museums across Poland. The two nobles part ways not with handshakes, but with synchronized bows, each one lowering his head just enough to flaunt the mustache in profile. As Janusz rides home, he holds his head high, not because he won, not even because he survived, but because, at every moment, his whiskers held, you trail behind him, catching glimpses of faces peering out from windows as he passes. Young boys whisper, older men nod with solemn approval. A woman tosses rose petals onto the road not for romance, but for respect. One old man even mutters, now that's a right-hand curl. And with that, Janusz finally allows himself a small smile. You're starting to understand the unspoken code here. Swords come and go, but a truly disciplined mustache, that's eternal. The next morning greets you with damp grass, bleating goats, and the faint aroma of elderberry pancakes drifting through the manor's kitchen windows. But upstairs, in the dressing chamber of Janusz, things are already tense. He's reading a letter. Not just any letter, a sealed envelope stamped with a golden rooster. You recognize that symbol immediately. It's the crest of the Radomirs, a noble family, infamous not for their politics or wealth, but for sporting the most aggressively groomed mustaches in the entire region. Janusz sighs. The letter is brief, cutting, and somehow fragrant. A duel has been proposed. Again, and it has something to do with a beard comment muttered over goose stew last week. Of course, but before you can even react, Janusz is already reaching for his mustache case, the one with a velvet lining, a hidden compartment, and a faint smell of clove oil and passive aggression. Today's challenge, it seems, demands even more refinement than yesterday's. And so, you're about to witness something sacred, the duel preparation ritual, known unofficially but very seriously as the mustache mass. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Facial hair maintenance among 18th-century Polish nobility wasn't a casual thing. Grooming was a deliberate act of self-discipline akin to prayer. Men would spend hours perfecting their mustaches before formal appearances, believing the shape of their whiskers projected inner character. A drooping curl, weak morals, asymmetry. A traitor, split ends, probably in cahoots with Prussia. Janusz lays out his tools with surgical precision. A warm cloth infused with lemon balm. A ceramic dish of wax he blended himself, allegedly using a secret recipe from his grandmother. A bone comb from Hungary, curved like a crescent moon. And, of course, his lucky trimming scissors, engraved with the phrase, honor by hair. He begins with a cleanse. Slow, circular motions. He hums softly a lullaby. No, it's an aria from a comic opera about a nobleman who lost his mustache during a duel and became a monk, a cautionary tale. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some nobles refused to sleep without mustache guards, little leather contraptions that kept their curls intact overnight. One man even wore a contraption that lifted the mustache off his face using a system of silk cords and a bedside hook. His wife left him. His mustache did not. As Janusz applies the wax, he does so in measured strokes. 1, 2, 3. Pause. Then the twist. It's not just habit, it's choreography. Each movement is practiced, intentional. He's not getting ready to fight. He's getting ready to be seen. The Radomir family is known for their vertical curls that defy gravity and possibly physics. Janusz, however, opts for a horizontal sweep, long and dramatic, like a falcon's wing in mid-flight. His valet approves with a discreet grunt. And yet, something feels off. Janusz tilts his head, frowns. He recombs the left side. Still uneven. He checks the humidity, then the angle of sunlight, still wrong. A third attempt, still wrong. A bead of sweat forms not from fear of dueling, but from the deeper, more terrible fear, bad grooming. And here's where historians still argue whether these intense rituals were about personal pride or social weaponry. Was it self-expression or a form of psychological warfare? After all, a perfectly groomed noble in battle attire radiates menace not because of strength, but because of preparation. At last, Janusz finds the balance. The curls settle in. You exhale. He does too. He adjusts his cuffs, nods once, and just before leaving, he tucks a tiny golden charm into the fold of his sash. A tiny comb, barely an inch long. A reminder, not of vanity, but of discipline. You follow him out into the chilly dawn as he mounts his horse. The manor shrinks behind you. Ahead, the Radomirs wait. But Janusz is ready, because he has combed. The gravel road crunches beneath horse hooves as Janusz rides toward the Radomir estate, flanked by two valets and trailed by an unfortunate stable boy, holding a satin-lined box labeled "Emergency Combs, Do Not Shake." The box jingles faintly. You're not sure if it's the combs or your sense of reason slowly unspooling. The countryside rolls past mist curling in the hollows like forgotten dueling spirits, pine trees standing sentinel like judgmental uncles. And all the while, Janusz is perched upright in the saddle, one gloved hand absently checking the curve of his right mustache tip. You can almost hear it whispering, "Perfect." As the manor comes into view, red brick turrets, two swans aggressively paddling in a fountain, shaped like a lion's sneeze. There's a sudden stillness. The Radomirs have assembled. And here's your mainstream historical fact. Formal duels in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were typically arranged with painstaking ritual. A second was appointed by each duelist to negotiate terms. Time of day, weapon type, distance, and even the angle of the sun were agreed upon with more care than some marriages. Today's terms: blades at dawn, single pass, first blood counts. But of course, no such encounter can begin before one crucial ritual, the mustache combing. A bell rings, not for church, not for war, but for grooming. Both parties retreat to their respective pavilions, not unlike boxers before a match, except with more lace and less yelling. Janusz's valet unfurls the comb mat, which is embroidered with his family's motto, Virtus in vibricis, virtue in the whiskers. He begins, the left side first, then the right. Each pass of the comb sends tiny shimmers through the wax until the whole affair resembles a pair of glistening commas poised for grammatical battle. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some dueling nobles carried pre-combed mustache wigs just in case of emergency. One unlucky baron's mustache caught fire while lighting a pipe, and he swapped in a velvet-lined spare so seamlessly that no one noticed, until it fell off mid-swing and landed in a duck pond. Back in the Radomir pavilion, Count Radomir himself is undergoing an equally intense pre-duel ritual. He prefers a double twist style, where each end coils upward like a cinnamon roll possessed by wrath. A servant uses a miniature rake to ensure even spacing. The whole thing looks slightly haunted and undeniably magnificent. At last, both nobles step into the dueling circle. The air is thick with anticipation and clove-scented beard oil. The seconds bow, a handkerchief drops, swords rise. But before the first swing, yes, before even a single parry, each man combs one last time. Not out of vanity, but out of duty. To duel with an unkempt mustache would be to dishonor not only oneself, but the sacred brotherhood of bristled brethren stretching back centuries. And historians still argue whether this behavior was a vestige of medieval chivalric codes or a theatrical performance meant to deflect from the absurdity of dueling over goose stew and hair-based insults. Probably both. The duel begins. Metal sings. Footsteps pivot. Cloaks swirl like offended shadows. Then, a slip. Radomir lunges, and his right mustache tip bristles against Janusz's blade. Time freezes. Gasps ripple through the crowd, not for injury, but for the unspeakable possibility that a mustache has been grazed. Everyone rushes in. The blade was clean, the wax held, but still, emergency combs are summoned. Janusz is seated on a velvet stool. His valet leans in, magnifying lens in one hand, fine-toothed comb in the other. He inspects, he grooms, he restores. It takes 7 minutes and one calming lavender compress. But eventually, the mustache is declared combat-ready again. No one even asks about the swordplay. Radomir bows, solemn. Your whiskers held true. Giannis nods softly. Yours danced like fire. No further violence is necessary. The duel ends, not with blood, but with bristles. You'd think, after a morning like that, Janusz might spend the rest of the day lounging in a silk robe, sipping elderflower cordial, and letting his mustache bask in post-duel glory. But no, this is the Polish nobility in the 1700s. The work of being fabulous is never done. Back at the manor, his valet carefully places the used combs into a lacquered box labeled Triumph, while a separate box marked Tragedy sits empty, save for one sad bristle from a previous grooming mishap. You don't ask. Janusz is already preparing for tomorrow's event, a diplomatic brunch that may or may not end in an argument about the correct pronunciation of Szlachta. The stakes, a potential duel, of course. To that end, he opens his travel kit, a thing of beauty and absurdity, tucked in navy velvet, lined with silk, and organized more precisely than most apothecaries. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Noblemen often traveled with personalized grooming sets. These kits were more than accessories. They were essentials, showcasing not only wealth but readiness. A noble without his comb was a soldier without his sword. Inside Janusz's travel kit, you find 3 mustache combs, 1 ivory, 1 tortoise shell, 1 made from the hoof of a particularly disobedient goat, a wax pot with a miniature warming tray and tiny silver ladle, a bristle buffer, a cloth for mustache blotting. You pretend not to see it's monogrammed, and tucked beneath it all, a folding mirror no bigger than a coin, just in case one needs to inspect a curl during battle. You watch him pack the kit like a general loading for war. Here's your quirky tidbit. There were nobles who swore their travel combs had magical properties. One reportedly claimed his ivory comb made him invisible to Frenchmen. Another refused to duel without combing under a cherry tree at sunrise. Superstition and facial hair. A perfectly groomed partnership. Janusz mounts his horse again. You sigh. Another ride. Another performance. This time, he's visiting the nearby estate of Baron Wadek, a man known more for mustache quantity than quality. His whiskers spill downward like a decorative curtain, often tied at the ends with ribbons that change color depending on mood. Today, chartreuse, which you assume means irritated. As Janusz arrives, he's immediately challenged not to a duel, but to a mustache off. No swords, no seconds, just pride, posture, and pomade. They face off on the veranda. Each man unsheathes his finest comb. Baron Wadek produces a double-pronged implement shaped like a tiny harpoon. Janusz counters with his goat hoof comb, glinting wickedly in the morning light. And now the crowd gathers. Here's how it works. Round 1. Waxing technique. Round 2. Curl symmetry. Round 3. Mustache endurance must remain unmoved for 30 minutes despite heavy wind and mild insults. It is, in a word, ridiculous, but also impressive. They comb in perfect silence. The only sounds are birds chirping, comb teeth, whispering through hair, and the occasional sniff of restrained nobility. And historians still argue whether these mustache offs were sincere displays of grooming talent or carefully staged rituals meant to diffuse tensions and avoid bloodshed. Many believe they were both, a sort of aristocratic pretext for bragging rights without the annoying inconvenience of dying. Janusz holds his own. His curls gleam. Baron Wadek grunts. There's a brief tremble in his left tip, a near catastrophe. Janusz, ever the gentleman, pretends not to notice. And when the wind gusts just enough to test their mettle, Wadek's ribbons flutter. Janusz's mustache doesn't move an inch. You don't need a judge to know who won. The Baron nods. No duel needed today. Just combs, curls, and the unspoken bond between 2 overgroomed warriors of wax. By the time the sun starts its slow descent into a pale orange haze, casting long shadows across the dusty roads and hedgerows, Janusz is back at his manor, But the day isn't over. Not when tonight's event is the evening salon, hosted by a nearby duchess whose idea of entertainment includes poetry readings, small talk about military horses, and passive-aggressive commentary on facial hair techniques. It's not a duel. It's worse. It's social combat. And in this circle, appearances are the battleground. The preparation begins anew. You follow Janusz into his dressing chamber, where a second grooming valet, this one more flamboyant, more theatrical, has taken over. He wears gloves not because of hygiene, but because the oils from unworthy fingers are death to wax. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Among the upper classes, evening events demanded a full aesthetic transformation. The nobility adhered to grooming schedules that rivaled military drills, with designated times for touch-ups, scenting, and of course, mustache realignment. It was all part of the social ballet. Tonight's challenge: impress the Duchess with a style that is both bold and refined. Assertive but not threatening. A curl too sharp might read as hostile, too loose, desperate. Janusz considers his options. His valet suggests the crescendo curl, a style that begins tightly wound at the center and unfurls into elegant, spiraling tips, a favorite of poets and amateur fencers. But Janusz hesitates. Instead, he chooses the imperial swoop, a broader, lazier curl that implies both confidence and mild disinterest in everyone's opinions. Perfect. Here's your quirky tidbit. Certain salons in Warsaw were said to enforce unofficial mustache dress codes. If your style clashed with the evening's moody, arriving with a martial-style twist during a pacifist reading, you might be asked to leave, or worse, invited to recite poetry about sheep. Janusz reclines as his valet applies a warming towel. Then, a rose petal tonic said to both soften and empower. The wax is heated over a candle scented with cedar and mysterious ambition. As the comb glides through his whiskers, you hear a tiny sigh from the valet. Not Janusz. It's like grooming the wings of Pegasus, he whispers. A little much? Yes. But you admire the dedication. Janusz dons a deep burgundy coat embroidered with gold thread and a cravat that requires its own folding diagram. His sword remains at his side, not for dueling, but for ambiance. You ride with him to the Duchess's estate, a candlelit palace of whispers and judgment. Laughter trickles from the windows. Someone inside is already quoting Virgil. You enter, heads turn. But not for the coat, not even for the sword, for the mustache. A portly viscount gasps. A noblewoman clutches her fan like it just offended her. Someone murmurs, "By Zeus." That swoop. Janusz accepts a flute of cherry cordial and floats from room to room, never breaking posture, never smudging the curl. He sits through a terribly long reading about a cloud's inner monologue. He nods politely at a man discussing barrel taxes, and when a jealous baron accidentally bumps into him, Janusz doesn't flinch. The mustache holds, and historians still argue whether these events were secretly arenas for dominance disguised as culture. Certainly, nothing declared your social prowess more efficiently than sipping a beverage with perfect lip-hair alignment while making eye contact with your rival across a bowl of lukewarm fruit soup. Later, the Duchess herself approaches. She peers at Janusz, eyes narrowed. "I heard you bested Wadek yesterday. I also heard your right curl withstood the Radomir assault." He bows modestly, one comb at a time. "My lady." She pauses. Then, "Would you care to judge tomorrow's mustache showcase?" Gasps ripple again. It's an honor, a risk, and a possible trap. But Janusz simply twirls his left tip in a slow, calculated spiral. "I'd be delighted." And just like that, the salon ends. Victory, once again, comes not with swords, but with style. Dawn comes with the slow inevitability of an aging valet. You wake to the sound of rooster crows, the clink of porcelain breakfast dishes, and most critically, the low hum of mustache wax being stirred over gentle heat. Today's the day. The Mustache Showcase. More than just a contest, it's a ceremonial gathering of the most dedicated bristle cultivators in the region. The Duchess is hosting it on the eastern lawn of her estate, under canopies of embroidered silk and banners painted with heroic images of past grooming legends like the Earl of Świętokrzyski, who allegedly once combed his mustache during a lightning storm and emerged untouched. Janusz, of course, has agreed to serve as one of the official judges, a risky move, considering several of today's contestants have publicly accused him of over-oiling and curl inflation in previous seasons. And here's your mainstream historical fact. Facial hair competitions were not a novelty of modern times. Records from various European courts, including the Polish-Lithuanian nobility, indicate that awards were granted for best grooming, most symmetrical whiskers, and even most battle-resistant mustache following particularly muddy military campaigns. Janusz's judging sash is made of green velvet, edged in gold thread. It features tiny comb motifs and one suspicious gravy stain, evidence of last year's soup-related scandal. He reviews the categories: Best Curl Symmetry, Longest Natural Growth, Most Artful Waxing, Audience Favorite via discreet ballot tucked inside velvet pouches. The infamously controversial Judge's Whim Award. You accompany him to the lawn, where contestants begin to arrive, each more dramatic than the last. There's Baron Igor, whose triple loop style is so elaborate it requires scaffolding. There's Lieutenant Oleg, who swears by a minimalist aesthetic, just a gentle upward flick, almost apologetic. And then there's the mysterious Servi, a masked noble who claims his mustache is too powerful to be seen fully in daylight. Janusz takes his seat beside the other judges, a duchess with a penchant for silver powder, an elderly bishop whose mustache droops mournfully, and a quiet poet who smells faintly of time and disillusionment. The showcase begins. Here's your quirky tidbit. One well-known contestant once trained his mustache to respond to music, claiming the vibrations helped it maintain volume. He played nothing but harpsichord for a full year. His mustache was stunning. His marriage did not survive. Back on the judging platform, Janusz inspects each contestant with the solemnity of a courtroom magistrate. He nods. He twirls his own curls thoughtfully. Occasionally, he scribbles something mysterious in a leather-bound whisker journal. You peer over his shoulder once. A single phrase is written. Left curl aggressive, right curl seeking validation. It's going to be a long day. Contestants parade past bows, curtsies, and the occasional flare of scented wax for extra flair. Janusz keeps his expressions neutral, even when presented with Count Leszek's mustache diorama featuring a miniature pastoral scene woven into the whiskers. He only arches one brow, and historians still argue whether these events were honest showcases of grooming artistry or absurd displays of aristocratic boredom. Either way, they attracted large audiences and no small amount of sabotage. At least 3 contestants today have guards stationed over their wax pots. Hours pass. The sun sinks lower, and at last, it's time for deliberation. The judges retire to a shaded tent filled with velvet cushions, chilled elderberry drinks, and arguments about the ethical implications of curling irons. Janusz stands, mustache impeccable despite the heat. I vote for Lieutenant Oleg, he says, understated. Modest, honorable, the Duchess counters with Baron Igor. The poet sighs and mumbles something about poetry. The bishop picks Servi, citing fear of divine consequence. A vote is taken. A compromise is reached. Lieutenant Oleg receives Best Curl Symmetry. Baron Igor takes Most Artful Waxing. Servi is granted a new category on the spot, Most Mysterious Whiskers. Janusz is asked to present the final ribbon himself. He steps onto the stage, curl gleaming, sash billowing slightly. Grooming, he says, is not just for vanity. It is for discipline, for dignity, for telling the world, I woke up early, and I chose style. Applause. Confetti made from dried rose petals drifts through the air, and for a brief moment, every mustache on the lawn bristles in approval. As twilight settles and the Duchess's lawn slowly empties of ribbon-laden nobles and the suspiciously graceful servants who've been sweeping up wax clumps and fallen beard beads, Janusz doesn't return to his carriage. Instead, he wanders. You follow him down a gently sloping path through the estate's orchard, where the air smells like bruised pears and just a hint of wet wool, courtesy of an escaped sheep nibbling at a decorative topiary. Tonight, he is quiet. No duels, no judges, no rivals flexing follicles in slow motion. Just him, the sound of his boots brushing the grass, and that unmistakable sense of a man reevaluating the curve of his left curl in the moonlight. He reaches into his coat pocket and pulls out an old comb, not the one made from ivory or goat hoofs. This one is wooden, chipped at the edge, worn smooth by years of use. The initials L, Gigapi, are etched faintly into one side. And here's your mainstream historical fact. Many noblemen passed down personal grooming tools as heirlooms. Combs were gifted between fathers and sons, engraved with family mottos, battle dates, or heartfelt inscriptions like "for honor and hair." These weren't just tools, they were legacies. Janusz turns the comb in his hands, lost in thought. You recall that his father, Lord Wacław, was once a dueling legend. A man so proud of his mustache that he supposedly refused to speak to anyone who didn't address it with appropriate reverence. Of course, historians still argue whether Wacław actually bested 23 men in mustache duels or simply had a gift for storytelling and an unusually photogenic face. What is certain, though, is that Janusz inherited more than just a curl pattern. He inherited a standard, and with that standard comes weight. Back at the manor, Janusz retreats to his study not to read, but to reminisce. The study walls are lined with portraits of his ancestors, all sporting various forms of exquisite facial hair. A few mustaches are so elaborate you suspect the artist gave up halfway and just painted smoke. He pauses in front of one painting, a stern man with a dark, angular mustache shaped like the wings of an angry sparrow. "Uncle Alexei," Janusz mutters. You remember the story Alexei was disqualified from a military ball for arriving with frosted tips? He never forgave the committee. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some nobles stored detailed grooming diaries alongside estate records. These included entries like applied lavender wax, faint curl wobble, blamed humidity, or tried new comb, felt judged by it. Janusz opens a drawer and pulls out one such diary, his own. You catch a glimpse of a recent page, 4th of October. Slight asymmetry. Duchess stared. May have lost credibility. Research emergency curl recovery techniques. He sets the diary down and lights a beeswax candle. The flickering light casts new angles on his curls. He leans in toward a mirror, gently adjusts one tippy, and then a knock at the door. It's his valet, holding a scroll. A summons. Tomorrow, another duel. The reason. Someone claimed Janusz's curls were the result of sorcery. Janusz doesn't flinch. He simply folds the diary, returns the comb to its velvet case, and picks up his sword. Another day, another accusation of magical grooming. Because in this world, when your mustache is this good, you'd better be ready to defend it. By morning, the rumors have already spread like oversteeped tea. Janusz, the curl enchanter, Sir Sorcery of the Sideburns, the whiskered warlock of Warsaw. You can't decide whether it's flattering or catastrophic. He certainly doesn't seem worried. At breakfast, Janusz calmly spoons rosehip jam onto toast, his curls immaculate, his cravat impossibly stiff, and his valet standing behind him holding a freshly steamed grooming cloak just in case. Here's your mainstream historical fact. While duels over honor were common, accusations of ungodly grooming weren't unheard of either. The 18th century may have embraced powdered wigs and fancy curls, but the fear of anything resembling alchemy or magic still lingered, especially if someone's wax formula was suspiciously effective during high winds. The man who's called for this duel is Count Bogusław, a jealous noble known less for his swordsmanship and more for his elaborate conspiracy theories involving rival wax suppliers and a goat who once predicted a rainstorm through mustache twitching. Janusz receives the scroll without blinking. He's just bitter, he says, biting into a pickled egg. His left tip collapses under pressure. Nonetheless, preparations begin. Today's styling must strike a balance. Elegant but humble. Combed but not enchantingly so. You follow Janusz to the courtyard, where his valet lays out a simplified grooming set, only 3 combs, 1 wax tin, and a modest handheld mirror. A statement is being made. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some noble courts, displaying too many combs at once was considered vulgar. A nobleman in Lublin was once ejected from a formal dinner for unveiling a 16-comb holster. His defense: one for every emotion. The court was not moved. Janusz opts for the dignified arc today. No twists, no flair, just a graceful sweep with an honest centerline. As he steps into the arena, a quiet clearing near a ruined chapel, he exudes calm. A slight breeze ruffles his cloak. His mustache does not budge. Count Bogusław arrives late and overdressed. His mustache is styled into a double helix, glistening with something vaguely glittery. You suspect pine sap? The seconds confer. The rules are set. Sabers. One clean strike. No enchantments explicitly stated. The duel begins. Steel clashes. Janusz moves lightly, economically. He parries with ease, gliding more than lunging. The crowd, small but nosy, murmurs with admiration. Then it happens. A sudden gust of wind blows through the trees. Janusz's mustache holds. Bogusław's wobbles, slightly. Tragically, he falters. Janusz disarms him with one sharp flick of the wrist. The count tumbles back untouched. Except for his pride, the duel ends. But the whispers begin again. Was it the wind? Someone asks. Or did his mustache command the wind? Another whispers. And historians still argue whether this moment was a true turning point, when Janusz's reputation morphed from nobleman to near myth. Was it simply excellent training and grooming discipline, or had his mustache crossed into the supernatural? Janusz approaches the fallen count and offers a hand, not smug, not boastful, but steady. "You lost to air," he says gently. Then he turns, cloak swishing, mustache gleaming, and walks away without a single hair out of place. That night, over mulled wine, you catch him quietly dabbing his mustache with warm rose water. No spells, no potions, just patience, wax, and the silent resolve of a man who knows the weight his whiskers now carry. Later that week, the whispers bloom into songs. You're standing outside the local bakery when a young stable boy missing one shoe and all sense of rhythm hums a tune under his breath. Oh, Janusz the combed. His wax never waned. He twirled down the lane, and honor remained. It's catchy, disturbingly so. Back at the manor, Janusz listens to the gossip with an expression that's part amusement, part regret, and a hint of, "I told you this would happen if the left tip ever aligned with Jupiter." He's trying to downplay things, truly. But it's hard when your mustache has inspired ballads, wood carvings, and a traveling puppet show where one of the puppets is literally just a floating, angry mustache with a sword. Today, though, he has something quieter in mind. No duels, no contests, just a visit to the Royal Grooming Archive, an elite collection housed in a secluded wing of a monastery, where monks have meticulously documented the history of noble hair rituals for over 300 years. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Monasteries across Eastern Europe preserved not only religious texts, but also records of daily life, fashion, grooming trends, and social customs. Some even maintained catalogs of facial hairstyles, favored by aristocrats and clergy alike. One 17-24 entry describes the swooping redemption curl as appropriate for penance or Thursday brunch. As you ride toward the archive with Janusz, the countryside hums in golds and greens. The trees seem to lean in, as if eager to witness greatness pass. The monk who greets you has a long, pointed beard and a mustache so bushy you're tempted to ask if it doubles as a bookshelf. He bows deeply. "We've prepared the chamber," he says, with the solemnity of someone announcing a royal birth. Inside the archive's grooming vaults, there are rows of glass cases. Behind them, combs, wax tins, portraits, and scrolls detailing legendary techniques, some lost to time, others still hotly debated by modern scholars with too much free time and not enough conditioner. Janusz kneels before one particularly revered artifact, the comb of Zygmunt, the Immaculate. According to legend, Zygmunt never dueled a day in his life because the perfection of his grooming made others too ashamed to challenge him. Here's your quirky tidbit. Zygmunt reportedly once used dew gathered from eagle feathers to cool his wax. He believed it added clarity of character. Others believed he was simply eccentric and overly attached to birds. Janusz studies the comb reverently. He doesn't touch it. No one does. But you see something shift in his posture, a quiet respect, a reminder that what he's doing, what they're all doing, is part of a longer tradition. The monk leans in. "We've added your likeness to the archive," he says gently, guiding you to a smaller chamber. There, among charcoal sketches of long-dead generals and eccentric earls, is a new portrait. Janusz, sword at his side, a subtle smile, and his mustache poised in a perfect dual arc like two crescent moons preparing to duel for dominance. Historians still argue whether this kind of immortalization was warranted or excessive, whether Janusz had truly risen to the level of grooming sainthood, or whether his popularity was simply the result of a bored nobility and some unusually photogenic curls. But you stand there, staring at the drawing, and you know, this isn't just a phase, it's a legacy. Back at the manor that night, Janusz doesn't gloat, he doesn't celebrate. He just sits on the veranda, gazing at the moon, combing once slow, deliberate, and sipping tea that smells faintly of pine and poetry. You awaken the next morning to the sound of hurried footsteps and the unmistakable jingle of combs in motion. Something's wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, but socially catastrophic, which in Janusz's world is somehow worse. The manor is abuzz. A messenger has arrived with grave news. Duke Clemens of Krakow is coming. Today, this afternoon, with his mustache. For context, Duke Clemens is a grooming purist, a minimalist, a man who famously once disqualified a noble from a poetry duel for using more than 3 strokes of wax. His mustache is neat, narrow, and terrifying in its restraint. He believes curls are frivolous, wax is a crutch, and mustache combing in public is an insult to the gods of grooming. And here's your mainstream historical fact. Ducal visits like these were as much about subtle power plays as they were about courtesy. A noble's estate would be judged on its hospitality, its cleanliness, and most tellingly, its grooming standards. To greet a high-ranking guest with an ostentatious curl could be interpreted as mockery, or a challenge, or both. Janusz stares out the window in his dressing robe. This, he says, sipping nervously from a tiny teacup, is a test. You watch as he orders his valet to clear away all curling implements. The wax tins are locked in a chest labeled Private Emotional Damage. The elaborate combs are placed in a drawer that snaps shut with the finality of a courtroom verdict. Only the basics remain: a plain boar bristle brush, a wooden comb with one missing tooth, and a single mirror, small enough to avoid temptation. Janusz opts for a grooming style called the Krakow Accord. It's a straight-across trim with a subtle upward lift barely noticeable unless you're the type of person who writes love letters to geometry. He practices his bow in the mirror, low, but not submissive, polite, but not apologetic, whisker-aligned. The carriage arrives just after noon. Clemens steps out dressed entirely in gray. His mustache is tight, cruelly precise, and if we're being honest, a little sad. The kind of mustache that's been honed over years of denying himself joy and butter. He says nothing at first, just eyes. Janusz's groomed but modest upper lip, and nods. You exhale. Barely. They sit for tea on the veranda, no pastries. Clemens doesn't eat anything that requires chewing near his mustache. Apparently, he once fired a cook for serving bread crusts. Here's your quirky tidbit. Clemens is rumored to keep a velvet pouch filled with judging ribbons, which he silently distributes throughout visits. No one ever sees it happen. One moment you're sipping cider, the next you find a gray ribbon on your saucer that simply reads, "Discretion, adequate." The conversation is stiff. Janusz deflects politely. Clemens critiques the arch of a garden hedge and inquires why the manor doesn't have a fountain shaped like a Roman nose. Then, suddenly, it happens. Clemens sneezes. Just once. But it's enough. His mustache unwaxed, unsupported, unyielding shifts. By a fraction. A flutter. A wobble. Silence. Janusz doesn't react. But his valet, bless him, produces a plain cotton cloth, no embroidery, no flourish, and offers it discreetly. Clemens accepts it, dabs once, and mutters something about tree pollen. The moment passes, but you feel it. The tiniest crack in the Krakow granite. And historians still argue whether that sneeze was genuine or a calculated test, an opening volley, to see whether Janusz would pounce with superiority or demonstrate restraint. He chooses the latter. As the Duke prepares to leave, he pauses, reaches into his coat, and leaves a ribbon on the tea tray. It reads, "Balance, Impressive. After the carriage rolls away, Janusz finally exhales. He smiles. Then, very quietly, he combs just the tip of his left curl into a slight arc so subtle it's practically theoretical. Revenge. No. Style. It's late evening now, and the manor has exhaled. The footman loosens her cravats. The cook hums something bawdy involving pears and politics. Even the bees in the garden seem less judgmental. Janusz, meanwhile, retires to his study but not to rest. No. Tonight he prepares for something altogether more challenging than duels or dukes or discreet ribbons. He's going to teach, not a grand lesson, not a formal academy, just a humble request from the local magistrate's son, Temek, 14 years old, full of hopeful fluff above the lip and the misguided belief that wax can solve personality flaws. Timek knocks gently and peeks in. Janusz, ever the noble, waves him over. There's a second chair waiting, a second mirror, a second comb. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Among Polish nobles, grooming was often a family affair. Young men were introduced to personal care rituals early on, and instruction in mustache maintenance was considered just as vital as fencing or statecraft. It wasn't vanity, it was virtue. Janusz begins by unrolling a leather toolkit of simple grooming items, brushes, combs, a soft cloth, and a small tin of lavender wax. Timek's eyes go wide. Do you always use lavender? Janusz raises an eyebrow. No, but your mother does. And if she's going to kiss you on the cheek after, you'll thank me. They begin with the fundamentals. Warm the wax. Always comb upward before downward, like lifting the hair's spirits before taming them. Don't rush the curve. The mustache knows when you're impatient, and never wax angry. That's how you get the dreaded rage twirl, a phenomenon that makes you look like you've just been insulted by a carrot. Here's your quirky tidbit. One 18th century noble is said to have kept a diary titled Of Curl and Character, in which he recorded emotional states based on how his mustache curled each day. Right tip pointing north, eats still anxiety. Left sagging, you'll missed lunch. Timek nods earnestly and follows Janusz's instructions with exaggerated care. His wax application resembles someone painting a postage stamp with a broom, but the effort is there. They practice greetings in the mirror. Too eager, Janusz corrects. Too haunted. Too like you're hiding a frog in your coat. Eventually, Timek finds a rhythm. He stands straighter, smiles subtly, and when he turns to Janusz for approval, Janusz doesn't smile outright, he just nods. It's not perfect, he says, but neither is nobility. The boy beams, and historians still argue whether Janusz ever formally mentored any young nobles beyond that night. Some say Timek went on to found the short-lived Order of the Subtle Mustache. Others claim he became a baker with unreasonably stylish buns. Either way, the legacy lives on. After Timek leaves, Janusz sits alone for a moment. He gazes at the mirror, at his reflection, at the mustache that has caused so much fuss, and for once, he doesn't comb it. He just lets it be. A symbol, a sentence, a smile. Then, quietly, he rises, snuffs out the candle, and steps onto the balcony. The moon is full. The wind is calm, and somewhere down the hill, a teenager with a crooked smile and lavender-scented wax is walking home like a prince. The season turns gently now, like a butler bowing his way out of a room. Summer folds into early autumn, and the air begins to change crisper, cooler, with that faint smell of apples on the wind. It's the kind of shift that makes you think of thick cloaks, warm drinks, and the dignified retreat of mustaches from the humidity of summer's dueling season. At the manor, the leaves drift lazily across the gravel path. You find Janusz sitting by the hearth, not reading, not writing, just sipping tea. A woolen blanket is folded over one knee. His cravat is slightly undone, and his mustache, still exquisite, even relaxed. The tips curve with the sort of self-assurance usually reserved for retired generals and cats on window ledges. You sit with him. The fire cracks quietly. No messengers arrive. No duels are scheduled. No dukes are en route with judgmental grooming glances. For once, peace. And in this calm, Janusz begins to speak not loudly, not grandly, but the way one speaks to a fireplace, a friend, or perhaps themselves. He tells you about his first real duel, not the outcome, but how his hand shook before it, how his wax melted in the sun, how he wondered if the curl would hold not because of vanity, but because it made him feel like someone who could stand his ground. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Personal grooming among nobility was as psychological as it was social. It wasn't just about how you looked. It was about how you prepared to face the world. A noble's mirror was as much a battlefield as any courtyard. Janusz laughs to himself. There was a time, he says, I believed a perfect curl could fix anything. But now, he trails off, running a thumb along one side of his mustache. Now, I know it just makes the problems look better. Here's your quirky tidbit. There is a rumored wax recipe passed down through 3 noble families, said to contain essence of hawthorn, shavings of silver, and a single tear from a disappointed tutor. No one knows if it works, but everyone agrees the name Resolve in a tin is inspiring. Janusz finishes his tea. The fire begins to dwindle, casting long shadows on the floor. Outside, a breeze stirs the ivy. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighs the melancholy cry of someone not invited to the salon. And then Janusz says something unexpected. I think it's time you tilt your head. He reaches up slowly, deliberately, and uncurls his mustache, gently brushes it downward, leaves it soft, natural, human. No duels tomorrow, he says. No contests, no scrolls, no secret judges hiding in the conservatory with scented ribbons. Just him and the world. And maybe if it's not too windy, a walk into town to buy pears that don't come with a side of politics. And historians still argue whether this moment marked the end of an era or simply a pause. Whether Janusz ever returned to the combed grandeur of his prime, or whether this gentle act of letting the curl fall was the greatest declaration of style yet. One thing is certain. Legacy isn't in the wax. It isn't in the trophies, the ribbons, or even the duels. It's in the way a young boy walks a little taller after a first lesson. In the way an old comb feels warm in your hand. In the way people remember not just your mustache, but your grace. The fire flickers low. Janusz leans back, and for the first time in a long while, rests. And now, as the fire's last light dances gently across the hearthstones, you let your own breathing slow. There's no more fanfare tonight, no curls to polish, no ribbons to chase, just you in this quiet room, where tea cools beside an empty chair, and the weight of old stories settles like autumn leaves on the ground. You feel it now, that soft kind of peace that doesn't need a parade. The kind that comes from knowing that some battles were won, others simply walked away from, and that sometimes the grandest act of nobility is to set down the comb, lean into the chair, and let things be. The air is cooler now, wrapping around your thoughts like a well-worn cloak. You picture Janusz's study one last time, the wax tins tucked away, the combs resting silently, the portrait on the wall watching with a knowing smile. In your own mind's mirror, you trace the curl not perfectly, not theatrically, but with affection. You remember the duels, the salons, the sneezes, the suspicious puppets, and you smile. Because history doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sighs. So let your eyes grow heavy. Let your thoughts drift like stray ribbons across a windless lawn. And as the fire fades, know this: you've earned the quiet. The style remains. And sleep is just the next great ceremony.